Okay, so this week we will be covering more of JavaScript and chapter 34 and a bit from the W3 School's website. So before I cover chapter 34, I want to cover a bit from this website here. So here in this menu here, this is where you will find the topics that are listed here. So for this week, all you need to read through are these different sections here. Of course, the final exam will have content from these sections, the chapter 34 and I believe 23 from week 14, and all the other topics in week 14. So let me just cover a bit about what's in these sections here. And actually, let me go ahead and open the week 14 content as well. Okay, so here's week 14. Here are all the different sections that you will need to review for the final exam. I did mention here that you don't need to review the let or the constant section, but as you can see in week 15, I listed the ones you do have to, but I did not list the ones you don't have to review. So if you see strings and then arrays, well, here's the strings section, and you actually skip these three sections and only cover arrays. Then the next item is conditions and then loop 4. So after arrays, you skip all of this and you only need conditions and then the loop 4. So let me go ahead and go through a bit about strings. Now, just like in the book, I did cover a bit about strings last time, or did I? No, I don't think I did. Yeah, I covered variables. Now, variables are very similar to strings because strings, you will keep information in the string, and it's really just a variable, and then it holds text in quotes. So that's pretty much all that strings are. It's like a variable that holds text. And so that's pretty much it. It has you have a space, you have letters, you can put numbers, and it's all in quotes. And you can use double quotes or single quotes, so either one will work. Okay, so that is strings, and I've mentioned this W3 School's site before. Always remember to ignore any ads that you may see on the top or on the side. And just read the content that's here. Notice that there's an ad in between, so just skip that. And just read all this content here, and then we have your try it yourself, where you can actually try the different the code within the website. So that is what I really like about this site. If there were any links within the site, you don't need to click anything that would be like within this content here. That would be additional information and would not be on any of the exams that I'm providing. And of course, you could hit the next, but like in this week here, next would actually take you to string methods, and that's something that you do not need to cover. You would just skip ahead to arrays. So this is all information about the strings. You can create a string, just like you have var. You're creating a variable called x, and then you're creating a string. Now, there's many different ways of doing things, so this is just things that you need to read, and the parts like here is what you'll be tested on in this week's quiz, because again, this week's quiz is covering chapter 34 and the content that you see on chapter 34. Like if I click here, This is chapter 34. I'll scroll up to the top. Chapter 34, last week you had a quiz on the content at the beginning of the chapter. But this week you'll have a quiz on content at the end of the chapter, starting with strings. Also note that I added some text on this new PDF. So those would be things that could be on the quiz as well. All these little messages I have here. But that would be basically the first half of the quiz. And the second half of the quiz will be questions like on content that you might see here. So a question could be, when using two equal signs, does it make it equal or does it assign a value? That would be some sort of question. So the questions will be based on the content that you see, basically in between this try it yourself section. You might see some code to kind of give you an example, or there'll be a question on a code like, is this right or is it not right? Or which one describes this? Something like that. But that's these areas here are where the questions would come from. Okay, so again, basically strings are just like variables. It is just like a variable that holds text in quotation marks. So that's strings. And when you look at arrays, and I also want to mention too, is that all programming languages have structures or ways of doing code, but they just use different syntax or just the way that it's written. So for example, here's a JavaScript array, and it's basically it's held within square brackets. You see that it's not using curly braces, it's not using parentheses, it's using square brackets. So JavaScript uses square. Another programming language could use curly braces, could be parentheses. The syntax may be different. It might not have a semicolon, it might just have a period or something like that. So the syntax is different, but the different structures will be the same. So you'll see an array in JavaScript, you'll see an array in C++ or Java or PHP. They all have arrays, but they're just written differently. So an array in general is a place. Basically, it's a way to store, like it says here, store multiple values in a single variable. So previously, we created a variable. Let's see, on the previous assignment, we created a variable and we actually just used str. Let me go ahead and show you. Let's see. Here we go, variables. Remember, we created a function and we didn't have to create a variable. Let me go ahead and scroll up to the top. We created a function and it had an alert in it, and then it just displayed this. But instead of just doing this alert, we actually created a string to hold the text that was going to be on the alert, and then we called the variable to be in the alert here. So we just added a variable there. And remember, a variable is just a place to store something. Okay. Well, an array is a place where you can store multiple values, but using the same variable. So previously it was str, but if you look at this example here, the array is actually called myCars, or the variable in the array is called myCars. But notice how there's square brackets here, and it starts with 0, and then 1, 2. So the 0 position holds this content. The position of 1, or the index number of 1, is Volvo, And then the index number of 2 is BMW. So we're using basically the same variable, my cars, but we have different different content in each of those positions. So so that's an array. Again, it's where you can store multiple values in a single variable. You can use cars and then just store 3 different ways of content, or three items in that variable. Now the thing is that when it comes to variable, or when it comes to arrays, you're going to refer to the content in the arrays with a number, and that number is called an index number. And notice that it always starts with 0. And that's one thing that you have to remember when it comes to computers or computer topics, is that 0 is considered a number. So when you're counting something, you don't start at just 1, you start at 0. And if you think about it, you can always think back to binary. Remember, computers understand zeros and ones, just a bunch of ons and offs. Well, it understands 0. So computers want you to, consider that 0. So if you look at this example here, it has 0, 1, and 2. Those are 3 different variables. So even though it's 0, 1, and 2, it ends at 2, you still have 3 of them. So always keep in mind that there is going to be a 0 position or index number. And I'll show you that in just a bit. Now going back to this website here, all this content here, what is an array? It's a special variable that holds more than one value at a time. That could be a question on the exam. Any of these this text here. Now if you look at this here, this is how we have previously created variables, where you have one variable and holds this, a different variable holds this, another variable holds that. But arrays, you don't have to create 3 different variables. And it does help. I mean, it might not seem like a big deal, like why do we even do it? But it saves space in the memory. It just makes things more efficient. And it also allows you to change the number of items quickly. So you can actually create a program that asks how many items do you want in the array, and then you tell it how many, and then you fill in, what the content in the array. So it is very useful. So it's really good to know. Okay, so let me go ahead and I am going to, here you can access the elements of the array by using the index number inside the square brackets. But I want to go ahead and do an example from the text. So I am going to go ahead and look at this content here. Now I know I just kind of jumped into arrays even before I did this strings here. So I'll cover that in just a little bit. Again, array is a special variable that holds more than one value at a time. So then you have an array, and then it's listing all of these values here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, so everything is in script tags, okay? I'm not sure if you would remember, but this is a comment. Remember, you can add comments in your code to describe anything that's in your code. And it could be anywhere in your code as well. So here in the head, I have, I already have script tags, so I could actually create, and there's different ways of creating comments, but this is one of the ways. You could just, at the beginning of whatever script you have, you can describe what the script is for. So you can actually do something like this: script is to loop, or something like that. Or you could even do like at the beginning, you could say something like, oh, you know, just like meta tags. Remember, we had meta tags in the head, and then we had where you would describe maybe the author, or maybe when the code was created. Those were meta tags, but you can also do that in, you know, programming. And again, there are different ways of doing it in different programming languages, but I think this is pretty common, where you just do the 2 slashes. So you could say created by me, you know, something like that. Put the date, something like that. So remember that comments are places where you can describe things in your code, but basically, when you run the code, it's going to ignore it because it's just a comment for us humans to describe things that you're doing. So that's your comment there, and that's what's, you know, with these 2 slashes here. So in this example here, there's actually quite a bit, because it's actually declaring a variable here. It's saying that X is a variable, and then it's saying that my cars is a variable, and here it's actually telling it that it's going to be an array. And then here it's basically filling in the items of the array up here, where it says my cars equals all of that. And then this part here is the loop that basically displays what's in the array. Now, since I am here, I want to make sure that you remember this, and I'll be showing you this in a little bit when I copy and paste. But when you copy and paste this code, if you choose to do that, and sometimes, you know, I'm not. It's a good question whether I prefer that you copy and paste the code, or that that you not, because if you copy the paste in code, you're not really getting detailed on what the code is, like remembering that there's an equal sign or that it's the square brackets. So, and it would be good for you to type it up. But on the other hand, you know, it does take time, but then you also may have issues like this. And I've seen this in other places where you copy and paste code. I believe even with different programs, like you copy it from one program to the other, the quotes, it's very common that the quotes are like misunderstood from one program to the next. So if something doesn't work, always be sure, and you know that you copied and pasted, go back and replace these quotes. And I'll show you that in a little bit. Another thing I want to say about this code is that if you see, you know, behind this red line here, it says Stooges for some reason. I think the author of the book was just putting in whatever variable, but he forgot to change it to my cars. And this code will actually not work because, or you actually won't even see anything on the page because there's nothing called Stooges. So it actually should say my cars right here. And that's what I wrote over here off to the side. And another thing that he really doesn't mention, most likely because he mentioned it when he was talking about PHP, but when you do my cars dot length, you're actually figuring out how basically how long or what the length is of the array. So since you have 0, 1, and 2, the length would be 3. So, and remember earlier I mentioned that you can actually ask a user, well, how many things do you want in the array? So it will actually make that many items in here. If the user entered 10, then it will create an array for 10 items. And then when you do this mycars.length, it'll know that, that it's 10. So, and then there's another way to figure out that there's 10. But anyway, doing dot length after after the variable of the array tells you how many items are in the array. So that's another side note there too. Okay, so I covered a bit of arrays, but I actually want to go back a bit on the website over here. So remember that we're covering strings, arrays, conditions, and loop 4, or at least that's what you're going to be, what I need you to cover. So that was strings, arrays, conditions, okay, and then loop 4. So I've already basically covered what strings are. That is basically like a variable that'll hold text. And then we have arrays, which is like a variable that can hold different different things, like different numbers, different text, but using just one variable. Then we have conditions, and I'll cover that in a little bit, but I also covered loops, and basically it is to repeat things over and over again. And then of course it will repeat things until it meets a certain condition. Like if it, like you only wanted to repeat up to 5 times, or until somebody says yes or something like that. So that would be a loop. But then we also have conditions, and you may be familiar with if statements. And basically if statements have where you have a block of stuff to be executed if a condition meets, or if a condition is true. Then you also have like an if else statement, where if it meets the condition, then it'll do the first block of code. And if it doesn't meet that condition, if it's false, then it's going to do a different block of code. So here's an example up here where if our, like let's say you asked somebody like what the hour is, and then they put a number less than 18, like if they entered 10, then it'll display good day. But if somebody entered, let's say 20 as hour, well, it's not less than 18. So in this situation here, it won't do anything, because we don't have an else statement that says, well, if this is not true, then say something different. So that's what this if statement is for. So here's the situation. If hour is less than 18, so if they entered 10, it's going to say good day. If they, let's say they entered 20 here, well, it does not meet that condition. It's greater than 18. So then it's going to do this else statement. It's going to say good evening instead. So there are many different ways of doing if statements. There's if, and then let's just say there's another condition that you may want to meet. So time is less than 10, then we're going to do that. But it basically, if it is between 10 and 19, it'll do good day. And then anything else, it'll say good evening. So there's these are condition statements. Now, one thing I wanted to mention though, is that remember last assignment, we did, 2 buttons, and if they clicked this first button here, click for blue, If they click that, then they would have a message that says you chose blue. If they click the click for red button, well, then it's going to display the message that says you chose red. So generally, we have already done something very similar to if statements because, well, this is a different situation here. And if you think about it, looking at a program like, yeah, let's just do File Explorer. So this is File Explorer here, and there's buttons up here, and remember that we're doing programming, so we are creating programs. And what is a program? Well, it is an application or something that we run on computers. So File Explorer is a program, Microsoft Word is a program, even your operating systems, if you're using Windows or Mac, those are programs. So these programs have, most of them, well, they all have to have some sort of menu or area on the top to do things. So, we have a view button up here. If you click view, it's going to show other icons on top. That's an if statement they have. If you click share, you're going to see something else. So, programs, everything you do is programmed into the computer to do, to respond on whatever the user clicks. So we generally, when we did that assignment, we did something very similar to the if statement. So those are conditions. And then I already clicked on the loop 4, where, again, we have loops that'll repeat something. And actually, this is a really good example here, because remember, I was talking about arrays. Now, remember, arrays is basically a way to have one variable for different items in the array. So you don't have to create a variable, many different variables. You could just use the one. Well, this is a good example here. I clicked on the loop 4, and this basically, you could, when you are displaying something, you can have a display line for everything you want to display. But the benefit of using a loop like this for loop is that you can actually save time, or even, well, you could save time, because remember, the more code you have on your program, the longer your program is going to take to run. So of course, we're creating small programs at this point, but if it's a really big program, we need to find ways so that it's not going to load, forever. It's not going to take forever, because you're going to lose your users. So to make this smaller and to do the same thing, you can just put it in a loop. So you see this text right here, text plus equal cars, then we have your array, and then a break. That is just going to be repeating. But you see this I here. Remember, this position here in the square brackets represents whatever item in the array. So if here I put 3, then it's going to represent, the third item in the array. And if I put 5, it'll represent whatever is in the 5th position. So when this loop here, this for, it actually uses that I to represent all the numbers in here. So every time it loops, it's going to change whatever I is. So it starts at 0, because remember, arrays always start at 0. And then it's, as long as it's less than the length of this cars variable, then it's going to loop. This right here basically tells you how it's going to increase, or how it's going to go from 0 to 1 to 2. We could also say that we want to do every other one or every third one, but typically we want to go through every every item. We just want to increase one. But anyway, there are many different things you can do with this, but this is like your basic. You start at 0, and as long as I, every time it increments here, as long as I is less than the length, then you're going to display this line here. Okay, and you could try it yourself to do that example there. But what I'm going to do is I want to actually do the examples in the book. And before I do those examples, I just want to cover this section here. Just know that, when we go back to the syntax, how things are written, it actually says in the book when it comes to JavaScript that you can actually skip the curly braces. Like you see these curly braces here, you could actually, this right before the script, you can skip that. Like you don't have to use it, and you don't even need the semicolons at the end, but it's really not a good idea because it makes it inconsistent, because everything else needs that. And then you also may run into issues, and you might, it just might be more difficult to find the issue. So it recommends, and I highly recommend, to be consistent with your code, because the last thing you want is more issues. And then, of course, remember that you're sharing your code. You're typically sharing your code with somebody else. You're not the only one that's going to be working on a program. And, you may even not be working at a company. You might get a better job. So the person that comes after you needs to be able to read it quickly instead of having to figure out what you were doing. And of course, remember, that's one of the reasons for using comments. So let me go ahead and stop this video here, and then I will do these examples in a different video.